Julius Caesar, known to all walks of people as being the greatest Roman general and emperor at the height of the Roman Empire. For obvious reasons, people are very heavily influenced by what they experience at a young age, and this holds true for everyone, even the great Julius Caesar, who would eventually become deemed as divinity by the Roman Senate. Various events stemming from political confrontations that occurred during Caesar's childhood had an impact on the way he would ultimately come to power and use his rule to be the greatest emperor that Rome would ever see. First of all, Caesar lived a modest childhood as his family was among the middle class during the time of the Roman Empire. He was born at a time when medicinal practices were limited, so the fact that his son or daughter had survived for another year was a good reason to celebrate. Labor in Caesar's house was of no worry to either him or his family due to the amount of hired labor they were able to afford, as every Roman family who could afford to own slaves used them to do all the heavy labor in the house. His father was a member of the Roman Senate, and this was the first groundwork that was laid to influence the potential of Caesar early on. The prime location in which Caesar was raised also impacted the outcome of his life. Caesar probably grew up in a small house squeezed between the butcher shops and taverns of the Suburra. Caesar was exposed to many different walks of life in the Suburra, as besides Latin he would have heard Greek, Aramaic, and a dozen other languages spoken by residents of the Suburra. Caesar's education was fairly identical to most kids who were given an education, and Caesar memorized literature including the ancient 12 tables laying out the basis of Roman law. This only aided him in learning early on and earning an advantage for himself to eventually become the emperor of the Roman Empire. The time period in which Caesar developed was ideal in serving as a basis for raising a great emperor. The year he was born was very important to the rule of Marius, as in 100, Marius was at the very height of his fame and power. During this time, it was common for violence and the use of force to be the primary action for officials, and in the middle of such crisis and violence, Caesar was born. Caesar was influenced to understand how violence helps to accomplish one's desires. Richard Billows explains that growing up in the midst of his political success guaranteed for the young Caesar a notable political career. Caesar was at an obvious advantage over many of his opponents, which were of families that were not nearly as prominent as Caesar's own family was. And finally, the relationships that Caesar held with his own opponents were very similar to those of opposing figureheads from his childhood. Fear from enemies was an important advantage to have in the Roman Empire, because if you were feared, then it was known that you understood the ways of war, which Caesar undoubtedly did. Caesar and his opponents thus represented two disparate realities. So wide was the gap, so great the mutual alienation. His opponents felt that the best way to deal with Caesar was to avoid him. Oftentimes he went uncontested in government decisions for this very reason. Caesar's opponents were bound to ask themselves whether or not it was incumbent upon them to do all in their power to oppose him. Caesar learned the tricks of the trade from family and other politicians during his childhood. Caesar has earned himself a spot amongst the all-time greats for many things, especially military astuteness and raw political power. He was given bountiful advantages, and unlike others, he knew how to use them to ensure success for himself and to guarantee that he would be the greatest at everything he did. Little did he know that he would be voted into divinity by the Senate shortly following his death. He earned it though, and surely his family would have been proud to know that that kid that grew up in the Suburra would go on to be the greatest ruler of all time.